Yeah, it's a great little scoot. It's got a new spark plug, it's got a new battery, air filter's nice and clean enough. Ran good about a year ago. Honestly, it shouldn't take much and you'll be out there enjoying the open road. Yeah, right here. Yeah, 552, yep.
It's got a new battery, new spark plugs, air filter's clean mostly. Shouldn't take much. Wow, it's beautiful.
Well, no, it's this one.
I need to make a phone call.
Scooter 911.
I have a scooter that has been sitting over a year and it will not start.
Well, if your scooter's been sitting a while, it's probably going to need some carburetor work. Now in this video, I'm going to be demonstrating how to rebuild your scooter's carburetor using this genuine Buddy 125. But nearly every carbureted scooter uses an identical setup. So even if you're not working with a Buddy 125, this video should still be able to help you out. This scooter has not run in over a year. Now our customer states before he stored it, this bike was running and riding perfectly fine. But you can almost guarantee that when a carbureted vehicle is stored for that amount of time, the fuel inside of the carburetor will deteriorate, and that creates sticky deposits that plug up the precision ports and orifices that allow the carburetor to operate properly. And that means this thing is ready for a carb service. In order to gain full access to the carburetor on the genuine Buddy 125, you're going to need to remove the seat bucket. Start by opening the seat with the key lock, and then you'll need to remove the 4 10mm bolts that hold the seat bucket to the chassis. Now that we have access to the carburetor, we can start by removing the throttle cable with a 12mm wrench. First, loosen the jam nut. That will release the tension, and you'll be able to remove the locking nut by hand. We'll loosen the band clamps that secure the carburetor to the intake manifold and the air box. You don't have to take these screws all the way out, just make sure there's a good amount of slack in the band clamp. Now that these two band clamps are loosened, we can now roll the carburetor over to gain access to some of the hoses that are connected. Now this Buddy has an emissions carburetor, so it has an extra line that goes to a charcoal canister. We'll start by removing this line. We can rotate the carburetor the other direction to gain access to the fuel line. This hose here belongs to the vehicle's crankcase recirculation system. This easily detaches from the airbox, and that'll give you a little bit more space to get in here to the fuel line. We should now be able to wiggle this carburetor out of its position. That's the airbox detached. And the carburetor is almost free. Our last step is going to be to disconnect the wires that control the auto enrichener. The auto enrichener connector can sometimes be difficult to find. On this particular bike, it's stuffed in here behind the starter solenoid. So we'll remove this from its little rubber mount. Here it is. Now we'll just snake the harness underneath the frame, and our carburetor is out. All right, with the carburetor out and on the workbench, we're ready for disassembly. Now we like to keep track of all the different screws and fasteners in this carburetor by sorting them into a little tackle box. This just helps keep track of everything and make sure everything goes back into the carburetor that we took out of the carburetor. We're going to start by removing the diaphragm cap. It's worth mentioning that these screws are not Phillips, they're actually JIS, which means that you need a JIS compliant screwdriver. The tips look like Phillips, but they're slightly different. If you use the incorrect screwdriver, you really risk stripping these fasteners out. Okay, underneath the vacuum cap, you'll find a spring. You want to keep that spring from bending or being lost. And we can now remove the vacuum diaphragm. Now be very gentle removing this. You don't want to create a tear anywhere in this diaphragm or your carburetor will essentially be ruined. I sometimes will stick my finger in through the mouth of the carburetor to ease in removing it. Ooh, this one's pretty stuck. There we go. All right, and inside this vacuum diaphragm, this is your main needle, and this is the needle retainer. You can see this needle is in real rough shape. The fuel has discolored it and left a sticky residue. Next, we're going to remove the auto enrichener. This is sometimes called an auto choke. There is one screw that secures the auto enrichener retainer to the carb body. Now we can gently remove this. And this is a good time to inspect the O-ring that seals the auto enrichener to the carburetor. I can see a little bit of cracking in this O-ring, so we're going to replace that before we put this thing back together. Okay, now we can remove the float bowl. The float bowl of the Genuine Buddy is held in place by 3 JIS screws. Wow. This carburetor is in pretty rough shape. You can see by the discoloration inside the float bowl that this fuel has definitely gone bad. It's created a lot of sticky residue inside the float bowl, and it's also coated the brass jets. Now here in the shop, we use a heated ultrasonic parts cleaner to get rid of a lot of this varnish. If you're doing this job at home, it's going to take some carburetor cleaner, some steel wool, and a lot of patience to get all of these components cleaned back up. Now, if you got to this point on your carburetor and you didn't have confidence that you were going to be able to clean all the gunk and varnish out of this thing, it would be a good option just to replace this carburetor. We do have those Genuine Buddy OEM replacement carburetors for sale on scooter911.com if that's something you're looking for. But we're going to continue with the teardown and get this thing spick and span. So now we're going to remove the pilot jet. The pilot jet is the smaller jet, and it's slightly off center. This is removed with a flat blade screwdriver. And you also want to have the tightest fitting screwdriver inside the jet to avoid the chance that you damage the jet while removing it. Well, that was really stuck in there. All right, there's our pilot jet. Now the pilot jet has multiple holes. So there is one hole that goes directly from the top to the bottom. You should be able to see through it. And there are also smaller perpendicular holes drilled into the bottom portion. You definitely want to make sure all of those ports are free of any debris or gunk. All right, next we're going to remove the main jet. Again with a slotted screwdriver. Now the main jet is much smaller in size, and it's also much simpler. There's only one hole from the top to the bottom that we need to make sure is clear and clean. Now we're ready to remove the emulsion tube. This is also sometimes called the main jet holder. To remove the emulsion tube on the Buddy 125, you need to use a 7mm wrench. Don't use pliers. You definitely don't want to mess this thing up. Now the emulsion tube has one main bore that's very large. There's a threaded portion that allows the main jet to be installed in it, and there are also perpendicular holes in the side of the barrel. Okay, now we're ready to remove this carburetor's float assembly. The float actually floats on top of the fuel inside the float bowl, and when it reaches a high point, it shuts fuel off from the fuel line and doesn't allow fuel to enter the carburetor. If this is not operating properly, what can happen is fuel flows into the carburetor and it ends up overfilling it. That can either end up introducing more fuel into your engine, or it can just leak out the bottom or the side. This float is retained by a small screw here near the pivot. And I can't even get my screwdriver in there, so I'm going to need to pick some of that shmoo out. And this whole assembly now should just lift out. Ooh, it looks like on this carburetor the float needle is stuck. We're actually going to need to sneak the float out from the needle so we can remove the needle from the seat. So we'll remove this pin. Very carefully snake the float out. And now we're left with the needle. Before I try and remove this needle from the seat, I'm actually just going to soak it with a little bit of solvent. And I'm just going to very carefully wiggle it to try and remove it without damaging it. It's starting to come free. There we go. This has a Viton tip, and that's responsible for regulating the correct amount of fuel in the float bowl. Now we can move on to the mixture screw. Now the original carburetor for the Genuine Buddy has a D-shaped mixture screw. This requires a special tool to adjust or remove it. We like to use these D-shaped driver bits. These can be inserted into a nut driver or anything with a 1/4 inch receiver. These are also available on scooter911.com. I'm just going to carefully remove that. All right, this is the mixture screw. This screw allows us to adjust the fuel and air mixture at idle up to 1/3 throttle. Now the mixture screw isn't the only thing that's down in this bore. There's also an O-ring, a metal washer, and a spring. This is our favorite tool for removing those components. This is just a piece of safety wire that we've created a small hook in. Here's the mixture screw spring. Here is the washer. And here is the O-ring. All right, we're on the home stretch now. Our last step is to disassemble the float bowl. So we'll start by removing the float bowl gasket. And then we'll disassemble the accelerator pump. The accelerator pump has a spring under this cap, so it's a good idea to hold some pressure on the cap while you remove the screws. There's that little spring I was talking about. Now we can remove this bellows. This just keeps dirt from getting inside the accelerator pump. And the diaphragm removes from the bottom. Make sure you keep track of this little O-ring here. You definitely need it if you want your accelerator pump to operate correctly. Okay, so before we soak our carburetor and jets in our heated ultrasonic carb cleaner, I like to run a wire through the jets just to make sure there isn't a solid blockage. If it is blocked, then soaking in any sort of carb dip won't actually clear it. You need to clear it before you soak it. This is a really small wire that I've pulled off of a wire brush like this, and it seems to do the trick just fine. You do want to be careful with the wire that you choose. If your wire is larger than the bore of the jet, you do risk punching the jet out. These are made of very soft brass. So I can see this wire passing all the way through this jet, so I know, even though it's not clean, there is a pathway for our solvent to get in there and clean this thing out. I'm going to do the same with these ports in the side of the jet. Just make sure everybody is at least clear. I'll do the same with the emulsion tube. And the main jet. All right, so I've got our jets and some of our smaller internal components here in this tiny cup. This just keeps them from bouncing around on the bottom of our machine. And we've got our ultrasonic machine set to 40 degrees Celsius, and we let them soak for about 15 minutes at a time. If you were doing this without an ultrasonic machine, you can fill a small cup like this with carb cleaner and let the components soak before you go at them with some steel wool and some more bristles. So I'm going to load this in the carb cleaner and check back with you.
So let's say you got a sippy little dipster that you're scooting around on, but it's clunking out on you. Or maybe you gotta give it a little bit more juice to get it scoot booting a little faster, huh? Well, zip on over to scooter911.com and check out some of our performance parts.
Ultrasonic machine has run its cycle. Very dramatic difference in color here. All right, and this thing turned out beautiful. You can definitely see how much cleaner it is after going through our ultrasonic machine with our special blend of 11 herbs and spices. All right, so we're ready to reassemble this puppy. All right, before we throw the jets and other components back into this carburetor, I do want to mention that we did not remove the main needle seat. You can see a little brass seat here just barely protruding in through the throat of the carburetor. Now this is removed by pressing it down from the top and out of the carb body. And when they're really, really corroded like this one was, it's very difficult to remove them without damaging them. So now that we've soaked it, we can easily get the needle seat out and inspect it for damage and blockages. This one is looking just gorgeous, but we'll clean it with a little steel wool before we go all the way back together. Now you can see we still have quite a bit of discoloration in the float needle seat. So we're going to go ahead and shine the outside of that with our steel wool, and then I'll show you a trick to polish the interior of that seat. Now to polish the interior of the float needle seat, we actually use a little bit of valve lapping compound and a Q-tip. Put a dab of the compound on the Q-tip. You can also put this end of the Q-tip in a drill if you want to be real fast with it. And that is looking very good. You can see the brass down there in the bottom is nice and shiny, and that's going to give a good area for the Viton tip of our float needle to seal to. All right, next we'll go back with our emulsion tube. Now, one trick to make sure that all of those perpendicular ports are clear is to block one end with your finger and spray some carb clean through it. You can see those are nice and clear. So it's ready to go back in. We're now ready to install the main jet. Of course, I've taken a little time to spray my carb cleaner through there to make sure that it is totally clear. And when you tighten the main jet, it will also tighten the emulsion tube. Now the pilot jet. Again, I've taken some time to spray some carb cleaner through the jet. All right, so now we're ready to install our float needle. Now the float needle, of course, has that rubber tip, so you want to inspect that to make sure it's not missing any pieces or damaged in any way. And the float needle also has this tiny button on top, and this button is spring loaded. This one is springing back perfectly, so we know it's ready to go. We'll install that into the float. Drop it into the seat. All right, you can see the float moves freely now. That needle comes in and out of its seat very nicely. That button allows a little bit of a spring. You can see the float bouncing off that button. Now we do need to check this float height. And of course you can use a float height gauge like this to properly set it to the manufactured specifications. But a quick and dirty way to check your float height is just to make sure that the seam in the float is parallel with the machine surface at the top of the carburetor. If it's a little bit down, because the carburetor sits this way, if the float is a little bit down, that's a low float height, and you might not actually get the fuel level up to your jets. If your float is sitting a little bit up, your float level might be a little bit too high, and that can result in fuel spilling out through the side of the carburetor or overfueling. Now, in order to adjust that height, you can just bend this little metal tab up and down to make sure that it seals that port off in exactly the right spot. That's looking pretty good to me. So we're ready to go back on with the float bowl. So when we rebuild a customer's carburetor, we like to go back with as many of the original components as we can. That means reusing their jets, reusing their components when possible. Now if a jet is damaged by somebody's neighbor getting in there with a wrong screwdriver or grabbing it with pliers, of course we'll replace those jets. But one of the parts that we always replace is the float bowl gasket. Now we get these float bowl gaskets from NCY. They're high quality, and it's just a little bit of extra insurance. These gaskets, of course, are held under pressure at the bottom of the carburetor, and that means that they can flatten over time. And the last thing you want is your customer coming back after paying for an expensive carburetor rebuild is saying, hey, my carburetor is leaking. So we'll just replace that gasket. So before we install this float bowl, one last thing we want to check is to make sure that this pickup tube for the auto enrichener is clear. So I'll spray a little bit of carb cleaner through that. And you want to make sure that you can see it shooting out through this port here. If it seems to be blocked, you can take your little wire piece and run it through the pickup tube just to clear any blockages. All right, I can see it bubbling out of there, so we know that that pickup tube is clear. Making sure that gasket fits down in that valley is very important. You don't want to pinch that in any way. Now we're ready to assemble our accelerator pump. So this is going to slide in from the bottom, slide our bellows to protect the internals. Next is this O-ring. Then the cap. All right, now it's time to install the mixture screw. So here's our mixture screw, all cleaned and polished. The way this needs to be assembled before it's installed is the spring first, then the washer. The washer's job is to protect that rubber gasket from being destroyed by the spring when we tighten this thing into the carb body. And the O-ring. Now that should stay assembled when we go to install it into the carburetor. If it falls off, that means that your O-ring is worn out and would need to be replaced. So we'll install that mixture screw with our mixture screw tool. And to get the correct setting for this, we're going to run it all the way in until it lightly bottoms out. Right about there is where it bottoms out. Feeling just a little bit of resistance. So now for Austin, we're about at sea level. So these buddies run best at 3 turns out. So I'm going to notice where my driver is. I've got the logo here, and I'm going to back it out 3 turns. So here goes 1, 2, 3 turns. Now we're ready to assemble the slide. So these rubber diaphragms can swell up if you soak them with a solvent. So we always just clean them with a little bit of warm soapy water. We'll insert our freshly cleaned needle into the center of the slide, followed by the retainer. Follow that with the spring. And here's my favorite trick to make sure that this edge of the diaphragm neatly seats in the channel here at the top of the carburetor. I like to invert my diaphragm, gently of course, lower it into the carburetor. I'm going to make sure that needle is at its home inside the main jet. And now I can make sure that that diaphragm is perfectly going into its channel. Okay, that's a nice fit. And I just like to insert my finger up under the slide and I can push it up. Then that keeps that diaphragm inverted and it keeps it in the channel a bit nicer. Grab that cap. Put that in place. Making sure that spring isn't bound up. Wiggle it around, make sure everybody's happy. And then run our fasteners back in through the top. And an easy way to check and make sure that your diaphragm is properly sealed is to raise this slide up and release it quickly. And it should come down nice and smooth and slow. See how slowly that comes back down? That means that we have a good vacuum seal here inside the carburetor. You can also operate this slide with a little bit of compressed air blowing in through this port here. That looks like it's operating beautifully. All right, and now we're ready to install the auto enrichener. Now, earlier I showed you that the O-ring that seals this into the carb body was cracked, and I don't want this thing coming back with a running issue, so we're going to replace that O-ring really quick. Ooh, and that just came right apart in my fingers. You can see how dry and cracked it was. Now these O-rings are kind of difficult to find in the exact correct dimensions, so we like to replace them with a Honda part. Gently install this on the enrichener. And just to ensure everything goes in its home nice and easy, I like to put just a dab of grease on my finger and work that around the O-ring just to make sure that it slides in without rolling or binding. Goes in nice and easy. Now we can reinstall that screw that holds the retainer in place. And last but not least, our little enrichener cap. And we're ready to test this. All right, so I've got an auxiliary fuel tank I'm just going to plug into this carburetor. Turn the fuel on. Last thing we want to check is make sure that accelerator pump is working. So the accelerator pump feeds the carburetor a little extra juice of fuel through this little brass plug here. It's going to shoot the direction of the fuel flow. You can see a very small jet of fuel shooting out of that little brass piece when I press the plunger down. That's what we're looking for. All right, I'd say this thing is ready to go back in the bike. All right, reinstallation of the carburetor is pretty straightforward. It's the exact same steps you use to remove the carburetor in reverse. Now reinstall it in the air box, and then into the intake. You definitely want to make sure that the carburetor is fully seated in the intake. If it's not installed flush, you do risk air entering the intake manifold around the carburetor and causing a vacuum leak. Install the fuel line. And that emissions line. Then we can tighten our band clamps. Reinstall our crankcase ventilation. Throw our throttle cable back on. Snug up the jam nut with our 12mm wrench. All right, that feels pretty good. So before we install the seat bucket, let's start this thing up and make sure it runs and doesn't leak. All right, so we've got our freshly serviced carburetor reinstalled in the scooter and we're ready for our first start. But keep in mind, this carburetor is empty. We've drained the fuel out of it in order to service it. And the carburetor needs to be full of fuel in order to deliver fuel into the engine. Now, most scooters utilize what's called a vacuum petcock or vacuum fuel valve. And that means that fuel will not flow from the fuel tank to the carburetor until vacuum is applied. Where does the vacuum come from? It comes from the engine. And the engine can only create vacuum when it's turned over. So, when you do your first initial startup, it might take a few seconds of cranking before the engine lights. It might light for a second and then die right away. That doesn't necessarily mean there's an issue. You still might just need to fill the float bowl. Okay, it's lit for a second and then it died. So let's crank it over a little bit more. Something else to note is when you open the throttle, you are actually reducing the amount of vacuum inside the intake manifold, which means you are reducing the vacuum to the petcock. So under this first startup, it's a good idea to crank the engine without adding any throttle. Give the starter a rest. Almost. All right, I'm pretty sure we have plenty of fuel in the float bowl, so now I'm going to apply just a little bit of throttle on this first startup. Here we go. Sounds like it idles pretty good too. All right, we've already visually inspected the accelerator pump, but it's also a good idea to test it in the bike. You can test the accelerator pump by snapping the throttle open very quickly. If the accelerator pump is not working, it'll stumble a little bit when you open the throttle, instead of just picking right up off the bottom. That's perfect right there. Perfect. All right, let's throw the seat bucket back on. Well, after a fresh carb service, this Buddy 125 is ready to get back out on the open road. And after watching this video, I hope that you are too. Keep in mind you can help support this channel and the content that we create by purchasing your scooter parts from scooter911.com. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out. If this video helped you out, let me know in the comments below. You know, we make these videos to empower people to take repairs into their own hands and to remind them that a scooter is just a bucket of bolts and the people who work on them aren't smarter than you. So until I see you next time, keep it shiny side up.
Open road.
Oh shit, let me try one more time. Washer. Dropped it. That was our shot.
Okay. Can we don't have to say stop, right? We're just gonna edit.